Hey guys, welcome back to Dan's Chess Lounge. I have an awesome game that I'm going to present to you guys today. It's the 1990 FIDE Championship match, Garry Kasparov against Anatoly Karpov. Now, and this is game number 20, and half of the match was played in New York, and then the second half of the match was played in France. It was like a dual sponsored match. One person from the States sponsored it, and then another organization from France sponsored the second half. And also the winner gets $3 million in prize fund and a diamond studded trophy that's worth over $500,000. So the prizes and rewards is very high. This is definitely high stakes chess at its finest. Let's go ahead and get into the game. Kasparov was white, Karpov was black. E4, E5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. Now this is the start of the Ruy Lopez, otherwise known as the Spanish game. a6, this is Morphy's defense here. Bishop drops back to a4. Knight f6 attacks the undefended pawn on e4. Now you have castle. White's not worried about that pawn there on e4. If Black takes the pawn right there, then White would just grab the pawn right back with rook e1. So that's why White's not worried at all about that pawn there. So he just he castles. Black doesn't want to go in for that knight takes pawn line there, so he just plays bishop e7. Develops his piece, gets ready to castle. They're following good opening principles and fundamentals. Rook e1. Now you have b5, striking out on the queen side, forcing that the light square bishop to a more passive diagonal for the moment, and it also clears the way for the light square bishop for black to come to b7 at some point. Bishop b3, d6. Solidifies his pawn on e5 and opens up the other diagonal for the bishop here. Now, White played c3, getting ready to support the advance of d4. That way he can have a strong pawn center. Castles. h3 is a good prophylaxis move. It prevents the light square bishop from going to g4. Now you have bishop b7. This is the Zaitsev variation. This is actually named after Karpov's trainer. He's been playing that. He was at the time he had been playing this variation for a while, and I guess there's no better one to learn from than the person who's it's actually named after. So the idea behind this for Black is to put his bishop on b7 and then advance on the queen side. White's idea is he's gonna put his pieces on the king side and he's gonna attack Black's king. So you have it's almost like a race. Black's attacking the queen side, White's gonna attack the king side. d4. Now rook e8 here clears the way for the bishop to drop back and defend. Be a defensive bishop there, defending the g7 pawn and king side once White's attack gets going, and also the rook is on a better file there. It's going to be able to protect the e pawn and even support the e pawn if it pushes. Knight b d2 was played in the game. Knight g5 is a drawn variation right here. It's only 11 moves in, but the players could have drawn this out right here. But everyone knows that Kasparov is not the drawish type of player. Kasparov plays for blood. He plays for victory. But it could have been a forced repetition, not a forced, but it could have been a threefold repetition right here if Kasparov would have played knight g5, because now you have the bishop and the knight hitting the f pawn. Rook goes back to f8. Knight drops back. Rook goes back. Knight g5 again. Rook goes back, and then the knight goes back. It would have been a threefold repetition. But you guys know that's not how Kasparov plays chess at all. So instead, he played knight b d2. Now, the knight here has very active plans here. The knight maneuver here is very commonly seen in the Ruy Lopez, where the knight goes to d2, then to f1, then to g3. Then it can go to f5 or either h5 here, all attacking the g7 pawn here and helping out for all types of attacks that could go down on the king side. It could even be things where if you get a rook or a queen here on g3, that maybe that knight could swing over to h6, and black cannot capture the knight because of the pin on that file there. It's all different types of attacks that can happen once that knight gets on that f5 square. Bishop f8, black continues with his plan of adding a defensive piece over there. The bishop is going to help out defend, and then it opens up the file for the rook. Now this is a really good move from Kasparov. If you look at the board, you see that Kasparov is having a little bit of development issues with his rook on a1 and also his bishop on c1. So he can't move his d2 knight here, because if Karpov ever plays e takes d, then you're going to have the combination of the rook here and also the knight here all attacking this pawn on e4. So that knight has to stay here to defend this e pawn here. So Kasparov says to himself, how can I develop my queenside pieces over here? He does that with a4, because now if these pawns get traded over here on the a file, then rooks can get swapped off, and now he's solved his problem of development over there. And then also, if these pawns get swapped off here, a takes b, then the remaining black b pawn here is going to be very weak and very tender. White's going to be able to make that a target and beat up on that. So this is a really good idea of playing a4. h6 is a prophylaxis move which stops the knight from jumping into g5. Bishop c2 puts the bishop on a diagonal that's not as good as it was on, but it's help supporting this e pawn here. That way maybe now white can start to move this knight out the way and go and continue with his plan of going, you know, to f1, then to g3 and to f5. So now black says, okay, I'm ready to continue with my plan of playing on the queen side. So he plays e takes d, c takes d. White's okay with that because now white has this big center. He's occupying the center with his pawns, and he just exchanged a central pawn for a c pawn. So white's happy about the exchange as well. Knight b4. Black wants to trade pieces here because another fundamental or idea is that if you are behind in space, if you don't have as much space as your opponent, you would like to trade pieces and give yourself some more room. So he would like to swap off his knight for this bishop here. And of course, Kasparov says, no way, that's not going to happen. So if you notice, white's pieces are a little tangled up here. He's not really unraveled yet. But one idea is for Kasparov to play rook a3, rook lift here, and then swing that rook over to e3. Then he'll have some more protection on this e pawn, and then again he can start to unravel his pieces with the knight going to f1 to g3 to f5 and starting to create some threats on the black king. c5, good move here. Black striking out with his plan on the queen side. d5, white doesn't want him to blow up the center like that. Knight d7. Now black is rerouting his knight to the queen side with the idea of if he can get c4 in, then he can sink this knight on a great outpost. First he can go to bring the knight to c5, then he can ultimately bring the knight to d3. And that would be a monster knight if he can post his knight up on c3. And don't forget, if he takes it, if white just takes that knight with the bishop, black has this other knight here reinforcing it. So then he'll have a great outpost. So that's a good plan here. But the one downside to this plan is that black is removing another piece from his king side. So don't forget, it's not all of just what you can do. You have to be aware of what your opponent can do as well. At some point, white is going to be able to attack black's king side. He's going to need pieces over there to defend. So the knight is moving another piece away from there. Rook A3, getting ready for to defend and play on hold his center basically. F5, Karpov strikes out to attack the center again. And the deeper idea behind this is to remove the defender of this D pawn here, the D5 pawn. So if this E4 pawn can fall, then this D5 pawn will fall as well. Then black's really going to be just steamrolling his pawns and his queen side at that point. Rook AE3 going along with his defensive plan here. Knight F6. It attacks. The knight goes to F6 really to hit the D5 pawn because this E pawn is going to fall whenever black wants to play F takes E, or if white plays E takes F, then the main threat here is to get rid of this D pawn here, because then that's going to like just really release black's position. Knight H2 is a difficult move to find if you're not a great player like Garry, Kasparov, which hardly anyone is. But Knight H2 makes room for the rook to slide over right here to G3, and then that's going to help with the attacks that's going to come eventually, and it's going to be a tactical melee after that. And then once this pawn here takes, or white takes, then the knight can jump into G4 with all types of threats going on here. So it's going to be the start of a tactical battle, which is the type of games that Garry Kasparov loves. I mean, that's his bread and butter. You know, he's a tactician. He's a tactical genius. So black senses that it's getting ready to be a fight over there on the king side, so he moves his king to H8. White plays B3 here to solidify the pawn on A4, and also now he's got a good diagonal to put his dark square bishop. He can bring his dark square bishop to B2. Now you have B takes A, B takes A, and C4, going along with that same plan that we discussed earlier, where if black can stick his knight on D3, then it would be a monster knight there. So now you have bishop B2, putting that bishop on a great diagonal here. F takes E, finally. Knight takes E4. White's pieces are starting to unravel here. And then black grabs that pawn on D5. And this is a good pawn sacrifice. Kasparov decides to go ahead and let black get away with that pawn so that he can move his rook in a more active square and file. So it's getting ready to get explosive here. Look how this dark square bishop is eyeing the king. You got the queen wanting to go to H5 and then maybe even take on H6. I mean, the knight is very close to the action here. It's getting ready to be a battle. Rook E6 is a defensive move that will stop some sacks that could happen. Knight G4. White is saying, hey, I'm going to get all my pieces into the battle. Queen E8 is a move here that is eyeing potentially, if this knight moves, can take on E1 here. And then here, knight takes H6. This is a knight sack that will expose the king. Kasparov does not care about material if it's going to lead to checkmate. So Karpov plays C3 in the game, right? He's like, well, if I'm going to get a piece, I would like to grab that bishop instead, because the bishop is a lot more dangerous than that knight is. If he would have took the knight, rook takes h6. Now you have knight takes d6. And that knight is a monster knight on d6 there. Don't forget that the rook here is hitting the queen. So black can't just take the knight right back. That knight is a monster knight. You've got the black king, kingside being exposed here and weakened here. Now this reminds me of the famous octopus knight that Garry Kasparov had in the 1985 championship game against none other Anatoly Karpov. That was a great Sicilian defense there. And if you guys have not seen that game, I'll put a link up here that'll pop up on the screen where you can check that game out afterwards. It's all about the octopus knight. And then in that game there, Kasparov, he unleashed his famous Kasparov gambit there. So make sure to check that game out too. It's a stellar game as well. Let's go back and see what happens in this game here. So again, Karpov plays c3 because he would like to swap off the bishop there instead of the knight, because the bishop is a lot more dangerous piece in this position. Knight goes to f5, and then he captures that bishop there. Queen g4. Now the queen is coming into the attack. So now white has most of his pieces hovering around the black king. It's getting very, very dangerous here. We've got all types of sacks possible here. You've got the queen threatening to go to h4 check. You've got the knight on f5 threatening to capture on g7. It's getting very, very dangerous for black. So then bishop c8 stops the knight takes g7 move because of the discovery that would happen as soon as the rook moved there. So like if white played knight takes g7, then black would play rook takes the knight on e4, and then the discovery on the queen there, that would be losing for white, because then black would just take on e1 check. So you have queen h4 check, the rook blocks, rook h6, but then that falls to knight takes h6, and now the black king is very exposed. It's super exposed, and you have all types of threats here. If you get knight f6 here, that's going to lead to a checkmate. But he can't play it right now because the rook on e1 is undefended. So king h2 is a good move here, great move here, because now if white plays knight f6, then queen takes e1 doesn't come with check. So queen e5, it attempts to pin the rook here on g3. Knight g5 here with the threat of knight f7, which is going to lead to a checkmate. So then you have queen f6 to guard that and stop that. And now you have rook e8. What a great attacking move here. Rook e8. Black is in a world of hurt right now. He's just getting walloped. Bishop f5. Now you have queen takes h6. Queen takes h6. The queens come off the board. Knight takes in a minute here. Knight takes f7. Knight f7, excuse me. Check. King goes down to h7, and now the bishop takes. Bishop takes f5, check. Now, white can go ahead and regain the material and swap that queen off. King g7. White takes the rook that's on a8. So at this moment, white is just taking all of black's pieces. Bishop e7 here. Rook b8. a5. Now at this point here, the game is just over for black. But the thing is, they have a time control that they have to meet. The time control was 40 moves in 2.5 hours, and they're right there coming along on move 40. So They both was very low on time, so that's why Karpov had not resigned at this point. They were both running super low, trying to make the time control. And then Karpov, he also had a prayer that his B pawn here would promote to a queen if Kasparov got super careless. So Kasparov plays bishop e4, trying to remove the knight here, the cover. King takes on f7, and then Kasparov plays bishop takes d5. And then they both made the time control. Black resigned here. Karpov resigned at this point because now he had time to actually sit there and think about his position and realize that his position was completely lost and hopeless. White has both rooks still, 2 rooks on the board, and the bishop, along with Black going against Black's bishop and knight. If Black would capture the bishop here, it's still lost there. It's still is a losing game here. You have 2 rooks here going up against the bishop and knight, and he's up 2 extra pawns as well. It's just and they're passed pawns at that. So it's just too much material and firepower there. So resignation was appropriate. So Kasparov would go on to win the championship here. He would be crowned the FIDE champion after this again. So guys, I hope you enjoyed the video today. This is one of my favorite Garry Kasparov games. Go ahead and like it if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to comment and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.